December 1945. The war was over. But for Sergeant Bob McAllister of Lowell, Massachusetts, a man who had crossed Omaha Beach, who had held his dying buddy in a ditch outside Cannes, who had come home carrying shrapnel in his left shoulder that the doctors decided was safer to leave in the war, had never really ended. He had one job now: guard 40 German women in a civilian internment facility outside Fort Devens, Massachusetts. He hated every minute of it. Until the morning he watched one of those women pick up a small white package, something he had handed out 100 times without a second thought, and begin to cry. Not from sadness, from something he could not name, something that made him feel for the first time in years that maybe the thing America had been fighting for was real after all. This is the story of that morning, and everything that came after it. By the end of this story, you will understand why Bob McAllister said 30 years later at his granddaughter's graduation that those 6 months in Massachusetts taught him more about what America truly is than all his years in uniform combined. Stay with us. To understand what happened inside that facility, you first have to understand the two worlds that existed side by side in December of 1945. In Lowell, Massachusetts, children were sledding down Merrimack Street. The smell of bacon and pancakes drifted from the diner on the corner of Central and Middlesex, the same diner that had been there since 1931, the same diner where Bob McAllister had eaten breakfast before his first day of school, before his first day at the mill, before the morning he and Tommy had taken the train to the enlistment office in Boston. Harry James was playing on the radio. Men were coming home. Women were crying in train stations, but the good kind of crying this time. America was exhaling after 6 years of holding its breath, and America was eating a real breakfast for the first time in a long time. Across the Atlantic in the same December, the city of Berlin looked like the surface of the moon. Women were pulling bricks out of rubble with their bare hands. The Germans had a name for them: Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. Children stood in food lines with coats that belonged to older brothers who had not come home. The temperature was 15 below zero, and there was no coal for heating. 3 meals a day was a memory that some people were already starting to doubt had ever been real. Those were the two worlds. One had won, one had lost, and somewhere between them in a converted school building, surrounded by chain-link fence 12 miles outside Fort Devens, 5 German women were about to receive the strangest education of their lives. From the most unlikely of teachers. Bob McAllister did not want to be their teacher. He did not want to be anything to them at all. He had been born in 1907, the second of 4 children, in a 3-room apartment above a hardware store on Appleton Street. His father, Sean McAllister, had come over from County Clare with $30 and a willingness to work that had never left him. His mother, Bridget, had kept that apartment so clean you could eat it off the floor, which the children sometimes did, because there was not always enough to put on the table. Bob had gone to work at the Merrimack Mills at 17, the same year Tommy, who was 2 years older and twice as loud, had started talking about what was happening in Europe with the kind of seriousness that made their mother change the subject at dinner. When Tommy enlisted in 1941, Bob did not hesitate. He could not explain it then, and he could not explain it later. It was not ideology. It was not patriotism in the way the posters described it. It was something simpler and older than that. It was the fact that Tommy was going, and Bob McAllister did not let his brother go anywhere alone. Tommy died on Guadalcanal in August of 1942. Bob received the telegram on a Tuesday, standing in a field outside of Algiers, eating a cheese sandwich. He finished the sandwich. Then he sat down on the ground for 20 minutes. Then he stood up and went back to work. That was the only way he knew how to do it. He had one private ritual with Tommy's memory, one thing he did when he thought no one was watching. In his breast pocket, folded twice and worn soft at the creases, he kept a photograph Tommy in his uniform taken 3 weeks before Guadalcanal, grinning the way he always grinned, as if whatever was coming was going to be fine. On bad nights, on nights when the shoulder ached and the ceiling of whatever room he was in seemed too close, Bob would take the photograph out and hold it for a while. He never looked at it long. He just held it. Then he put it back and went to sleep. He came back from the war in the spring of 1946 with a Purple Heart, a shoulder that ached every time the temperature dropped below 40, and a silence that Mary, who had been waiting for him in the same house on Appleton Street for 4 years, did not know how to fill. The posting at Fort Devens was the Army's way of easing him out. Not enough for combat, not ready to go home. Give him something administrative. Something quiet. They gave him 40 German women. He stood at the gate on the first morning and watched the trucks pull in and thought, this is the worst assignment I have ever had. Worse than the hedgerows. Worse than Hurtgen. At least in Hurtgen he had known who the enemy was. Here he was not sure what these women were, and not knowing made him more uncomfortable than anything else. The facility itself was not what most people imagined when they heard the words detention camp. It had been a small agricultural school before the war, and it still looked like one. Red brick buildings with white trim, a central courtyard with a flagpole, vegetable gardens along the south wall that nobody had tended in 2 years. Inside the dormitory rooms held 4 bunks each with wool blankets and a small dresser per person. The mess hall served 3 meals a day. The infirmary had a full-time physician. There were rules and there were guards and there was a chain link fence with 2 strands of barbed wire at the top. But there were no watchtowers, and the guards had been given specific instructions about tone and conduct that Bob had read twice before he understood they were serious. Treat them with basic courtesy, use their names, address complaints through the proper channels. No unnecessary physical contact, no raised voices without cause. Bob had read those instructions and thought of the men he had seen in the photographs coming out of the camps in Germany. He had thought of what his army had found when the gates of those places opened. And then he had folded the instructions and put them in his breast pocket and decided that he would follow them, not because he felt generous, but because that was what separated what he was from what they had been. That was the whole point. That was what Tommy had died for, or at least that was the version Bob was able to live with. The 5 women arrived on a Tuesday evening in the second week of December. They came in separate transports, processed through different intake procedures, brought together in the same dormitory wing, almost by administrative accident. They had nothing in common except their nationality and the fact that someone in Washington had decided they needed to be held and questioned before being cleared to return to a Germany that barely existed anymore. Bob was at the gate for all 5 arrivals. He did not speak German, and he did not try. He checked their paperwork, confirmed their names against his list, and directed them to the intake officer. He looked at each face for exactly as long as the job required, and not a second longer. The first woman was named Liesel Brandt. She was 34 years old, thin, in a way that spoke of years rather than days, with dark circles under her eyes and hands that were too steady. Bob noticed the hands because he had learned in the war that the way a person held their hands told you more than their face did. Liesel Brandt's hand said, "I have been holding myself together for a very long time, and I am not going to stop now in front of you." The second was Hannah Schreiber, 28, who arrived with no luggage except a small cloth bag and an expression of compressed fury that reminded Bob of every 19-year-old soldier he had ever met on the first day of basic training, angry at everything, not sure yet who deserved it. The third was Clara Muhlberg, 52, who stepped out of the transport vehicle the way a woman steps out of a car in front of a hotel, spine straight, chin level, waiting for someone to take her bag. Nobody took her bag. She picked it up herself without changing her expression, but something in her eyes shifted very slightly, like a crack appearing in the wall of a building you had assumed was solid. The fourth was Erna Vogel, 40, who walked quickly and kept her eyes on the ground and said "Danke" in a near whisper when Bob handed her the intake paperwork, as if gratitude were something that needed to be hidden. The fifth was Ilse Hartmann, 45, who stopped in front of Bob and looked at him for a full 3 seconds before taking her paperwork. She was measuring him. He understood that immediately. He had been measured by enemies before, and this felt different, more deliberate, more clinical, like being assessed by someone who was filing the results away for a specific future purpose. Bob wrote one line about her in his journal that night. "She watches everything. I don't trust her." It was the most accurate thing he wrote about anyone during the entire 6 months. He wrote about all 5 of them that first night in the green Army issue notebook that Mary had packed in his kit, along with 3 cans of peaches and a note that said, "Write everything down. You always forget." He had been writing in those notebooks since Normandy, not because he had literary ambitions, but because Mary was right. He forgot things. The writing kept them from disappearing entirely. What he wrote on that Tuesday night was brief and without sentiment. 5 women, ages 28 to 52. One looks like she hasn't slept in a week. One looks like she used to be somebody. One looks like a school teacher back home. One is angry at everything. And one, I don't know what to make of her. She watches everything and says nothing. I don't trust her. He closed the notebook and turned off the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the Massachusetts winter pressing against the window. And he thought about Tommy for a while, which was a thing he did every night, regardless of what he had intended. And then he went to sleep. He had no way of knowing that morning was 3 days away and that a cardboard box would change everything. The box arrived on a Friday. It came in with the regular supplied delivery stacked between cases of canned vegetables and boxes of soap, an ordinary brown cardboard box with a property sticker from the Quartermaster Corps and a contents label typed on an index card. Bob signed for it along with everything else, carried it to the supply room and set it on the shelf without opening it. The distribution order came through that afternoon. The box was to be given to the women in Building C, the dormitory where his 5 Germans had been housed. Medical supplies, personal hygiene monthly issue. Bob pulled the box off the shelf, tucked it under his arm, and walked across the courtyard in the cold December air without thinking about it any more than he thought about distributing soap or boot polish. He set the box on the table in the common room. The interpreter assigned to Building C, a young private named Kowalski, who spoke German with a Pittsburgh accent that the women found difficult to understand, explained what the box contained. Bob stood near the door with his arms folded and watched. He almost missed it. It happened quietly, which was why he almost missed it. There was no dramatic reaction, no outburst. What there was instead was a silence with texture and weight, the kind of silence that falls in a room when everyone present suddenly understands the same thing at the same moment and nobody knows what to do with the understanding. Liesel Brandt picked up one of the small white packages and held it in both hands. She knew exactly what it was. She was a trained nurse and she had known the second she saw it. What she was doing was something else entirely, something Bob could not name at the time, something he would spend years trying to find the right word for. She held it the way a person holds something they have been told for a very long time they do not deserve. Hannah Schreiber looked at the package in her hands and then looked up at Bob with an expression he genuinely could not interpret. It was not gratitude. It was not anger. It was something with the texture of an accusation without being one, as if he had said something offensive without opening his mouth. Clara Mulberg set her package on the table in front of her and placed both palms flat on either side of it, not touching it, just framing it. Her hands were trembling. Bob noticed the hands because he always noticed the hands. Erna Vogel tucked hers into her apron pocket. Immediately her face flushing red, her eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance that was not Bob and not the table and not anything visible in the room. And then there was Ilse. Ilse Hartman picked up the package, looked at it for a moment with that same measuring attention she had given Bob at the gate 3 days earlier, and then looked directly at him. She said something in German, not to Kowalski, directly to Bob, in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. Then she looked back down at the package and said nothing more. Bob did not ask Kowalski what she had said until later that evening, after the others had gone to dinner, and the common room was empty. Kowalski listened to Bob's description and shrugged and offered a rough translation. She said something like, "We have not had these in years." Bob repeated the word silently. "We have not had these in years." He went back to his quarters and opened his journal and wrote one sentence. Then he crossed it out. Then he wrote it again. "Something happened today that I cannot explain. I will figure it out later." He did not figure it out that night. He lay in the dark and turned the sentence over and could not find the bottom of it. He had handled that supply box the same way he handled every supply box. Soap, boot polish, canned goods, personal hygiene. He had not thought about what was inside because thinking about it was not part of his job. It was just a box. But Liesel Brandt had held that small, white package in both hands as if it were the most significant object she had encountered in years. And something in that gesture, something Bob McAllister had no language for yet, had lodged itself somewhere inside him and was not going to move. He was still thinking about it 3 days later when Dr. Margaret Sullivan knocked on the doorframe of his office. Dr. Sullivan was 42 years old from Southie, the kind of Boston Irish that made Lowell Irish look relaxed with iron gray hair she wore pinned back without ceremony, and the direct gaze of someone who had decided long ago that hedging was a waste of everyone's time. She had been hired through a civilian medical contract, which meant she had no rank and no particular obligation to be diplomatic with people who did. and she generally was not. She had a folder under her arm and she placed it on Bob's desk without asking permission and opened it to a page of handwritten notes. "Sergeant," she said, "I need to talk to you about what you distributed last week." Bob looked at the folder. "What about it?" She did not sit down. She stood across the desk from him and spoke in the measured tone of someone presenting a clinical finding, not a moral argument, which was, Bob would later realize, the only reason he did not stand up and end the conversation immediately. She told him that at least 3 of the 5 women in Building C showed clinical signs of chronic infection consistent with years of inadequate menstrual hygiene. She told him this was not specific to these particular women. It was a pattern documented in female patients from Germany across multiple facilities. She told him that in 12 years of National Socialist governance, the production of basic feminine hygiene products for civilian women had never been prioritized. The German war machine had bandages for soldiers. It had not had time for women. Bob said nothing. "The products in that box," she said, "are something their own government decided they did not deserve. That is the medical context for what you handed out last week. I thought you should have it." He looked at the folder. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. "With all due respect, doctor," he said, "what their government did or didn't do is their problem, not mine." He stood up and put on his cap and walked out of the office. He did not write in his journal that night. It was the first night since Normandy he had skipped. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the Massachusetts winter and did not sleep until very late. In the morning, he was back at the gate at 0600. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the first snow of the season was falling in slow, deliberate flakes that landed on the courtyard without sound. Building C was lit from the inside. Through the window of the common room, he could see Liesel Brandt sitting at the table with a cup of something hot between her hands, looking out at the snow. She did not see him. She was not looking at anything in particular. She was just sitting there in the early light, holding something warm, watching the world outside the fence. Bob stood at the gate and watched her for a moment and thought about what Dr. Sullivan had said, about the box, about the decision someone had made somewhere in an office in Berlin that this particular thing did not need to be provided, that it was not worth the materials, that the women who needed it were not worth the consideration. He thought about Tommy. He thought about what Tommy would have said, because Tommy had always been the one who said things while Bob was the one who stood there and considered them. Tommy would have had something clear and direct to say about a government that decided its own women were not worth a few cents of cotton. Tommy would have said it loud and without apology, the way he said everything, and then he would have looked at Bob and waited. Bob stood at the gate in the falling snow and thought, "Boss, I still don't know what to do with any of this, but I don't think I'm done thinking about it." He was not done, not even close. 3 days later, he went back to Dr. Sullivan's office. He had not changed his mind, but he had seen something through the window of Building C at 2 in the morning that had kept him awake 3 nights running, and a man who had survived Normandy and Hurtgen did not lose 3 nights of sleep without finding out why. What he had seen was Clara Mühlberg sitting in a chair beside her bunk at 2 in the morning, spine perfectly straight, not touching the chair back, staring at the wall. The clock said 2:15. The building was silent. Every other person in that wing was asleep. He had watched her for 5 minutes from outside the window. She did not move. She did not cry. She did not pray, as far as he could tell. She just sat there in the posture of someone who had spent 52 years holding themselves upright and could not stop even when there was no longer any audience to hold themselves upright for. Bob had seen that particular kind of stillness before. On a boy from Indiana in the Hurtgen forest the night before the boy had done something that ended his war permanently. It was the stillness of a person who had run out of reasons to keep going and had not yet found new ones. He reported it through channels, which was the correct procedure, which was what Bob McAllister always did. He filed the notification with the duty officer and requested a medical evaluation without explaining his reasoning in detail, because the duty officer was 23 years old and would not have understood the Indiana boy from Hurtgen, and Bob was not in the habit of explaining things he knew without being able to say how he knew them. Dr. Sullivan saw Clara that same morning. She came out of Building C an hour later and found Bob at his post by the gate. "You were right to report it," she said. "She's not in immediate danger, but she's not okay. Thank you, Sergeant." "Just doing my job," Bob said. "Doctor." Sullivan looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not read. "Sure you were," she said and walked away. He watched her go and thought, I don't know what that means. Then the gate buzzer sounded and a supply truck pulled in and Bob McAllister went back to work. But that night, for the first time in 3 nights, he slept. And in the morning, the world had shifted by exactly the width of one small, white package. Not enough to see from the outside. Not enough to name or describe or put in a report. Just enough to know that something had changed and that the change was real and that it was not going to stop. The war was over. But something else, something Bob McAllister did not have a word for yet, was just beginning. The second week of January 1946 arrived with a cold front that pushed down from Canada and settled over Massachusetts like a judgment. The temperature dropped to 4 below zero on the third night, and the pipes in Building B froze and burst at 3 in the morning, which meant that Bob McAllister spent the first 2 hours of January 15th standing in a flooded corridor, directing maintenance crews, while 31 German women stood in the courtyard in their coats and watched American soldiers solve a problem with the same methodical efficiency that had apparently also won a war. He noticed from the corner of his eye that Erna Vogel was watching the maintenance crew with an expression he had seen before on the faces of people encountering something ordinary for the first time. Not the burst pipe, the response to the burst pipe, the way Corporal Davies radioed for the right equipment without raising his voice, the way the crew arrived in 12 minutes and began work without needing to be told twice, the way nobody hit anybody or threatened anybody or asked permission from 4 levels of authority before picking up a wrench. Erna Vogel stood in the courtyard with her coat buttoned to her chin and watched American soldiers fix a broken pipe, and something moved across her face that Bob could not name but recognized. It was the expression of a person quietly revising a document they had believed was final. He did not speak to her. He went back to directing the maintenance crew. But he filed it away alongside the other things that had been accumulating since December, the things that were building towards something he could not yet name. Dr. Margaret Sullivan began her formal medical evaluations the second week of January. Bob was not present for the evaluations themselves, but he was present in the corridor outside the infirmary door. On the afternoon, she saw Liesl Brandt, and he heard enough to understand that whatever was happening in that room was not a standard intake examination. He heard silence mostly. Long stretches of it, then Dr. Sullivan's voice low and even asking something, then more silence, then once a sound from Liesl Brandt that was not a word and not quite a breath, a sound that a person makes when something they have been carrying for a very long time is acknowledged out loud for the first time, and the acknowledgement turns out to be heavier than the carrying. Bob stayed in the corridor longer than he needed to. Then he walked back to his office and sat down at his desk and did not open his journal for 20 minutes. When he finally did, he wrote one line, "I think I have been doing this job wrong." He stared at that line for a long time. Then he wrote underneath it, "I don't know yet what doing it right looks like." Then he closed the notebook. Dr. Sullivan found him the following morning. She sat down across from his desk, which she had never done before, and looked at him with the direct gaze that Bob had decided was either her most useful quality or her most exhausting one, depending on the day. "I want to tell you something about Liesl Brandt," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to." She folded her hands on her knee. "She's a trained nurse, 8 years of practice, the last 4 in a military hospital in Berlin. She has more clinical experience than half the medical staff I've worked with in this country. She has been treating herself and the women around her with whatever she could find, which for the last 3 years has meant improvising with things that would make you uncomfortable to hear about. She has done this without complaint, without drawing attention to it, and without once, as far as I can tell, considering the possibility that she was entitled to anything better." Bob said nothing. "The package you handed out in December," Dr. Sullivan continued, "was by her own estimation the first properly manufactured hygiene product she had handled since 1941. Not because they didn't exist in Germany. They existed. They were manufactured. They were allocated to certain people in certain categories. Women in Liesl Brandt's category were not on the list. That was a decision someone made, a deliberate administrative bureaucratic decision that she lived with for 4 years and accepted as normal because everything around her had been arranged to make her accept it as normal." She paused. The radiator in the corner of Bob's office ticked in the cold. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for her, Dr. Sullivan said. I'm asking you to consider what it means that the first time someone treated that particular need as a basic medical necessity rather than an inconvenience or a luxury was here, in a detention facility, on the other side of a war, by people who are technically her captors. Bob looked at the window. Outside the courtyard was empty. The snow from the January cold front had crusted over, and it caught the flat morning light and held it without warmth. "What do you want me to do with that?" he asked. "Nothing specific," Dr. Sullivan said. "I just think you should have it." She stood up. "She asked me yesterday if there was any work she could do in the infirmary. She said she needed to be useful. I'm going to tell her yes. I thought you should know." She left. Bob sat at his desk and looked at the frosted window and thought about a woman holding something in both hands in December in about 4 years and about the weight of a decision made in a Berlin office that Lieselbrandt had never had the chance to question. He thought about that for a long time. The incident with Hannah Schreiber happened on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of January. He had been making his afternoon rounds through Building C when he passed the common room and saw Hannah sitting at the table with her back to the door, bent over something. He had seen her in this posture before several times over the past weeks, always alone and always bent over whatever surface was available. He had assumed she was writing letters. He paused in the doorway and saw that she was not writing letters. She was drawing on the inside cover of a regulation issue notebook, using what appeared to be a sharpened pencil stub approximately 2 inches long, the kind of pencil that had been worn down to near uselessness and then kept and sharpened again because throwing it away was unthinkable. The drawing was detailed and careful and executed with the focused attention of someone who had been doing this for years on whatever surface and with whatever instrument came to hand. It was a face, a child's face maybe 7 or 8 years old, rendered with enough precision that the expression was legible from the doorway. The child was not smiling and was not crying. The child was watching something. The eyes were directed slightly to the left of the viewer, towards something outside the frame, and the expression was the expression of a person observing something they understand they should not be seeing or should not be allowing, and who are observing it anyway. Bob stood in the doorway a moment too long. Hannah turned and saw him. She closed the notebook immediately with the reflexive self-protection of someone accustomed to their private things being taken. Bob raised one hand in a neutral gesture and walked on. That evening after his shift, he went to the supply room and found what he needed. A regulation green notebook, the same kind he used himself. Standard Army issue unused. And a box of pencils, 6 in the box sharpened, and complete the kind of pencil that had not been worn down to a 2-inch stub by someone making do. He left them on the table in the common room before the morning meal. No note, no instruction, no explanation. Just the notebook and the pencils on the table where anyone might have left them for any reason. He was in the courtyard during breakfast, out of sight of the common room windows, when Kowalski came out and told him that one of the women had asked who left the supplies on the table. Bob said he didn't know anything about that and went back to his rounds. 3 days later, walking past the common room in the early afternoon, he glanced through the window and saw that the notebook was open on the table in front of Hannah Schreiber, and that she was working in it with the focused intensity of someone doing work that matters. The box of pencils was open beside her. She had used 3 of them down to half their original length already. He did not slow his pace. He did not look for longer than a second, but he noted it alongside the other accumulating things. A week later, he saw one of the drawings. He had come into the common room to deliver a schedule change notification, which Kowalski was supposed to have handled, but had not, and the notebook was open on the table, and Hannah was not there, having stepped out for the afternoon exercise period. Bob set the notification down, and because the notebook was open and he was standing directly in front of it, he saw the page. The drawing covered the full page. On the left side, a woman stood at a window, her back to the viewer curtain held aside with one hand. Through the window, visible in careful detail, a street scene, people being led by uniformed figures toward a vehicle. The people being led wore coats that were not warm enough. One of them was carrying a child. On the right side of the image, the interior of the room was meticulously ordinary. A table, chairs, a cup on the table still steaming. The woman at the window was not doing anything. She was watching. The cup on the table was still warm. Underneath the drawing, in small, careful handwriting, Hannah had written in German, "Ich habe zugeschaut." Bob did not read German. He found Kowalski 20 minutes later and described the words, and Kowalski translated them without commentary. I watched. Not I did not know. Not I was not there. Not I was afraid or I was young or I was told not to or I had no choice. Just I watched. Bob stood with that translation for a moment. Then he went back to his afternoon rounds. He was building something. He still did not know what it was. The thing with Clara Muhlberg came to a head on a Wednesday night in the last week of January. Bob was making his late rounds, which he did himself 3 nights a week and delegated to the junior guards the other nights. He was not required to do his own rounds. He had started doing it in December and had not stopped for reasons he had not examined too closely. He was passing Building C at 2200 hours when he heard a sound from the end of the corridor. Something moved or displaced in the particular way that objects are moved or displaced when a person is no longer being careful about the sounds they make. It was a small sound. Bob almost walked past it. He did not walk past it. He opened the door to Clara Muhlberg's room and found her on the floor beside her bunk. Not fallen, sitting deliberately as if she had decided the floor was the appropriate place. The chair beside the bunk was pushed against the wall at an angle that suggested it had been moved out of the way. Her hands were in her lap and she was holding a piece of paper. A letter. Bob could see the German postmark from where he stood. He had been in the army long enough to read a room. He had been in enough rooms like this one. He knew what this was. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him and stood for a moment. Clara looked up at him. Her face was composed in the way that faces are composed when composure has become the only thing left, when everything behind it has been removed, when the structure is holding, but the building is empty. She said something in German. Not to Kowalski, who was not there. To Bob, who did not speak German. She said it anyway in a low voice without urgency, the way a person speaks when they have been talking to themselves in the dark for a long time and have simply directed the words outward. Bob did not understand a single word. He looked at the displaced chair against the wall. He looked at the letter in her hands. He made the calculation that he had made in Hurtgen Forest with the boy from Indiana, the calculation that has no formula and no procedure manual, the calculation that is either instinct or experience, or the particular kind of knowledge that comes from having been in enough rooms where it mattered. He crossed to the displaced chair, moved it back to its place beside the bunk, and sat down. He did not call for Kowalski. He did not reach for the emergency notification procedure posted on every door in the facility. He sat down in the chair and folded his hands on his knee and looked at Clara Muhlberg. And she looked at him, and there was a long silence in which the Massachusetts winter pressed against the single window of the room. Then Clara began to speak. She spoke for a long time. Bob understood nothing. He sat and listened to the rhythm of it, which told him things that the words would have told him anyway, the places where her voice tightened, the places where it dropped the pauses of someone circling, something they could not approach directly. She was telling him something. Not because she expected him to understand, because she needed to say it, and he was the only person in the room, and he was staying. He thought about Tommy while she spoke. About the way Tommy had once talked for 2 hours on a train from Boston to New York, about a girl in Lowell who had broken his heart, and Bob had listened to every word, and at the end Tommy had looked out the window at the Hudson River going past and said, "Thanks, that helped." And Bob had said, "I didn't say anything." And Tommy had said, "I know. That's why it helped." Clara spoke for 15 minutes, then she stopped. She looked at the letter in her hands, and then at the window, and then at Bob. Bob said the only thing he could say, which was also the only true thing, "I don't know what you said, but I heard you." She did not understand the English. He was fairly certain of that. But something in the inflection, or in the simple fact of the sentence being spoken directly and without distance, reached her in a way that words in a shared language might not have done. Something in her face changed. Just the smallest degree of loosening, the way a fist opens by one finger when the immediate danger is past. Bob stayed for another few minutes. Then he stood up and told her in the even tone of a man doing his job that he was going to ask Dr. Sullivan to check in with her in the morning, that this was standard procedure, that there was nothing unusual about it. He did not know if she understood. He said it anyway. He went to the duty phone and made the call to the medical officer on call. Then he went back to his rounds. In his journal that night he wrote, "I sat with a woman for 15 minutes tonight, and I didn't understand a word she said, and I think it was the most useful thing I've done since I got here. I don't know what to do with that. I'm going to leave it for now." He closed the notebook. Outside, the Massachusetts winter had gone quiet the way it goes quiet at 1 in the morning when the temperature has dropped past the point where the cold has anything left to prove. Dr. Sullivan saw Clara the following morning. She came to find Bob at his post afterward. "You were right to report it," she said. "She's not in immediate danger, but there's a letter from her daughter with information about her husband's file being included in the Nuremberg documentation. She found out last night. She's been holding that knowledge alone since she arrived." Dr. Sullivan paused. "I'll be seeing her twice a week going forward." Bob nodded. "You stayed with her," Dr. Sullivan said. It was not quite a question. "It's my job." "You keep saying that. It keeps being true." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she said, "I want to talk to you about something I'm planning. A health session for the women in Building C general medical information. I'm going to include some topics that are not standard for this type of facility." She paused. "I'd like you to not reassign your guard post that afternoon." Bob looked at her. "You want me to be there?" "I want you to not be there," she said. "There's a difference." She turned and walked back toward the infirmary. Bob stood at his post and turned that distinction over in his mind for the rest of the morning. Not be there. He understood what she was asking. She was asking him to be present for something that he could technically have avoided, that nobody would have faulted him for avoiding, that lay entirely outside the definition of his job as written in any document he had ever signed. She was asking him to make a choice. He did not answer her. He thought about Tommy for a while, which was not unusual. He thought about the boy from Indiana, and about Liesl Brandt holding something in both hands in December, and about Hannah Schreiber's drawing of a woman at a window, and the two words written underneath it in careful small handwriting. "I watched." He thought about what it meant to watch, and what it meant to stay, and whether those were the same thing, or whether they were in fact the most different two things a person could do. By the end of his shift, he had not made a decision. Or rather, he had made it without deciding, which was the way Bob McAllister had always made the decisions that mattered. He was not going to not be there. The health session was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of February, and the morning of it was the kind of Massachusetts morning that makes no promises. The sky was white and low, and the air tasted of iron, and the bare trees along the fence line stood in the kind of stillness that precedes either snow or nothing at all. Bob McAllister took his post beside the corridor door that connected the main building to the common room of Building C. It was a legitimate post on his rotation. Nobody who checked the schedule would have seen anything unusual, but he positioned himself so that the door stood 3 inches open, and the 3 inches was not an accident, and the particular angle at which he stood was not an accident either. 31 women attended. Every woman in Building C and 12 from the adjacent building who had heard through the particular information network that exists in every closed facility, regardless of language barriers, the network that runs on whisper and gesture, and the look one person gives another across a meal table. Dr. Sullivan had said the session was optional. Optional had been interpreted as compulsory in the way that matters not through coercion, but through the simple human recognition that what was being offered was something worth having. Dr. Sullivan began with nutrition. She talked about caloric requirements, about protein deficiency, about the particular damage that extended periods of inadequate food inflict on the body in ways that accumulate quietly for years before they surface. She spoke plainly and without condescension, in the tone of a physician presenting information to patients she respected, and the interpreter rendered it into German with enough accuracy that the meaning moved across the language gap without losing too much of its weight. Then she moved to hygiene, infection prevention, the relationship between cleanliness and mortality that had only recently in the scope of medical history been properly understood and acted upon. She talked about what happens to a body when basic care is withheld not through poverty or ignorance, but through decision, through the deliberate administrative choice to prioritize other things. And then she reached the part of the session that she had told Bob she intended to include, the part that was not standard and the part that lay outside the normal parameters of a detention facility health briefing in the winter of 1946. She picked up one of the small white packages from the table beside her. The room changed when she held it up. Bob felt the change through the open door without seeing it. The quality of the silence shifted. 31 women who had been listening with the polite attentiveness of people receiving information became 31 women who were suddenly completely physically present in the room. Many of you were confused when you first received these, Dr. Sullivan said. Her voice was even. She was not performing. She was reporting. I want to talk about that confusion and about what it means and about why it matters medically and otherwise. She spoke for several minutes about menstrual health in clinical terms, about infection risk, about the long-term reproductive consequences of years of inadequate care, about the specific patterns of damage she had documented in her examinations of the women in this facility. She did not soften it. She presented it as the medical fact it was. Then she said the thing that Bob heard through the open door and that lodged itself permanently in the part of his mind that did not release things. In Germany, she said, you were told that sacrifice was strength. You were told that endurance was virtue. You were told that a woman's discomfort, her pain, her basic physical needs were secondary to the requirements of the state. This was not poverty. This was not scarcity, at least not primarily. It was a choice. Someone sat down and made a list of what mattered and what did not, and your bodies were on the second list. I want you to understand that clearly because I think many of you have spent years believing that what you endured was normal. It was not normal. It was a decision made by other people that you were required to live inside of. The room was completely silent. Clara Mulberg's voice came from somewhere in the middle of the room, and even through the door, and without understanding the German, Voigt recognized the voice, the particular register of a woman who has been holding a question for a very long time and has finally decided that the cost of not asking it is higher than the cost of asking. The interpreter rendered it, "Why do you care about us? We are German. Our country started this war." Bob heard Dr. Sullivan's pause. He had heard her pause before in conversation with him, and he had learned that her pauses were not uncertainty. They were the moment before precision. You are patients, Dr. Sullivan said. Patients receive treatment. That is the rule I work by. It is the only rule I have found that holds up under pressure. There was a silence. Then Hannah Schreiber's voice, younger and more direct, the German rendered into English by the interpreter with the flatness of someone transmitting rather than editorializing. Did you lose someone in the war? Another pause. Longer. My brother, Dr. Sullivan said. He is buried in France. I tell you this not because I want your sympathy. I tell you this because I want you to understand that I am not treating you because I have forgotten what happened. I am treating you because I refuse to allow what happened to determine what I become. There is a difference between those two things. It is the most important difference I know. Bob stood beside the door and looked at the wall across the corridor and felt the mid-shoulder ache of the shrapnel the doctors had left in and thought about Tommy. He thought about the specific weight of Tommy's absence, which was not the same as grief exactly. It was something more permanent than grief. Grief being a process with stages and eventual accommodation, this being more like a subtraction that did not restore itself. He thought about what Dr. Sullivan had just said. He thought about the difference between forgetting and refusing to be determined by. He thought, I have not made that distinction. I have been trying to forget, which is not the same thing, and it has not been working, which is why the shrapnel shoulder wakes me up at 2 in the morning, even when the temperature is fine and there is no physical reason for it. He did not move from his post, but something in the way he was standing changed some small internal adjustment that would not have been visible to anyone watching, but that he felt distinctly the way you feel the moment a knot you have been working at for a long time finally comes loose. The session ended 40 minutes later. The women filed out past Bob into the corridor, and most of them did not look at him directly, which was normal. But Liesel Brandt, who was one of the last to come through the door, stopped for a moment in the corridor and looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not gratitude, not animosity, something closer to recognition, as if she had noticed that he had been standing there throughout the session and had understood why. She said nothing. She walked on. Bob closed the door the remaining 3 inches and continued his rounds. That evening, he wrote in his journal for the first time in 4 days. He wrote for a long time, filling 2.5 pages in his cramped handwriting. He did not record what Dr. Sullivan had said because he knew he would not forget it. He recorded instead what he had thought while she was saying it. He wrote, I think I have been doing this wrong since the beginning. Not the job I have been doing correctly, but the larger thing, the reason for the job. I think I believed that caring about what happened to these women was somehow in competition with caring about what happened to Tommy, as if there were only a fixed amount of it, and if I spent any on them, there would be less for him. But that is not how it works. I know that in the abstract. Tonight I started to know it in some other way that I do not have a word for yet. He closed the notebook. Outside the window, it had started to snow. The meeting between Ilsa Hartman and the man from Washington happened on a Thursday morning in the third week of February. The car was a dark sedan with government plates and no markings, and the man who got out wore a civilian suit and carried a briefcase, and had the look of someone who spends a great deal of time in rooms where the purpose of the meeting is not written in any memo. Bob processed his credentials without comment. The man had clearance at a level that made Bob's own clearance look like a library card. He asked for Hartman Ilsa, and Bob walked him to the interview room and stood outside. 45 minutes later, the man came out and asked to speak with the facility commander immediately. Bob walked him to the commander's office and then stood in the corridor. The commander's door was solid wood, and the corridor was not designed for overhearing conversations. And Bob McAllister was a professional soldier who did not eavesdrop on his superior officers' private meetings. He stood in the corridor and performed his function, which was to be present and available. But at one point the voices inside rose briefly above their usual register, and through the solid door in the badly designed corridor, Bob heard three words with enough clarity to be certain of them. She was ours. He stood in the corridor and looked at the bulletin board on the opposite wall, which contained the week's duty roster and a notice about meal schedule changes and a memo about facility maintenance protocols. He looked at these documents without reading them and thought about Ilsa Hartman, who he had noted on the first night as the one he did not trust, who he had watched for 6 weeks with the wary attention of a man who has learned that stillness and silence in a person can mean many things, not all of them the same. He had been right that she was not what she appeared to be. He had been completely wrong about what she was instead. She was ours. He remained at his post, he performed his function. But the three words moved through the back of his mind for the rest of the day like something searching for where it belonged, rearranging other things as it went. 2 weeks later, in the first days of March, Liesl Brandt began working in the infirmary. It had been arranged through proper channels. Dr. Sullivan had submitted the formal request citing clinical need and the detainee's documented professional qualifications. The commander had approved it. Bob had been informed as a matter of procedure. He had initialed the paperwork and filed it and thought nothing more about it until the first morning he walked past the infirmary window and saw Liesl Brandt on the other side of the glass in a white coat doing something efficient with a tray of medical instruments. He stood outside the window and watched her work for perhaps 10 seconds. The scene was so unremarkable in its competence, so entirely professional, so completely like what it would have looked like if you had taken this woman and placed her in any hospital, in any country, that Bob stood there longer than he intended. Then he walked on. That evening he wrote to Mary. He wrote twice a week, which was more than he had written during the war, when the letters had been infrequent and carefully edited by the part of his brain that did not want her to worry. These letters were different. He was not sure when they had become different. Sometime in January, he thought. He wrote Mary, I want to tell you about a woman I work with who is not American and who I did not respect at the beginning, and who I am embarrassed to say I did not respect because of things I assumed without looking. She is a nurse. She is the best clinician I have seen in this facility, including the people who are being paid to be clinicians. She spent 4 years doing her work without the basic materials her work required because someone in her government decided those materials were not worth providing. She is doing her work now with the proper materials, and she is doing it exactly the same way, which tells me something about the kind of person she is that I think it would take me a long time to explain properly. I will try when I get home. Mary wrote back 10 days later, Bob McAllister, you have been trying to explain things to me properly for 20 years. I am still waiting. Come home soon. I will make bacon. He read that letter 3 times and then folded it and put it in his breast pocket, which was where he kept letters from Mary, in the same pocket where Tommy's photograph had always lived and where Hannah's drawing of Tommy would eventually come to reside. The night before Ilsa Hartman's departure was a Sunday in the last week of March. Bob knew it was happening because the paperwork had crossed his desk and he had initialed it as required. On that Sunday evening, he made sure to be doing his rounds past Building C at 2100 hours, which was within his normal rotation, and he slowed his pace slightly as he passed the common room window. Through the window, he saw the 5 women, all of them, the first time he had seen all 5 of them, in the same room at the same time without an official purpose, organizing them. They were sitting in a loose circle. Ilse was speaking. The others were listening with the particular quality of attention that people give when they understand they will not have this opportunity, again the attention that memorizes rather than simply receives. Bob watched for a moment. Ilse's face in the lamplight was different from how it was during the day. During the day, she wore the measuring, containing face of someone who was managing information. In the lamplight of the common room on the Sunday before her departure, she wore something less managed, more honest than vulnerable. The face of someone who has decided that the particular protection of concealment is no longer necessary and is setting it down. He heard through the window glass not the words but the rhythm of what she was saying, and he heard at a certain point the sound of Clara Mulberg crying. The sound that comes when a person has been unable to cry for a very long time, and the ability has returned unexpectedly, like a door opening in a house you thought had only walls. Bob walked on. At 5 in the morning, he was at the gate. Ilse came across the courtyard in the early dark carrying a small bag, escorted by the night duty officer. The facility vehicle was waiting. The air was cold and smelled of March mud and the particular sharpness that comes before dawn, in New England the smell of a world that is about to change its temperature and has not decided yet whether it wants to. Erna Vogel was standing at the edge of the courtyard in her coat. She had been awake, Bob understood, all night. She and Ilse stood together for a moment and spoke in voices too low to carry, and then Ilse placed something in Erna's hand, a small piece of paper, and Erna closed her fingers around it. Then Ilse walked to the gate where Bob was standing. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him with the same measuring attention she had given him on the first night, but it was different now. The measurement of someone who has been conducting an assessment for months and has arrived at her conclusions. Then she spoke to him in English. Clear, unaccented, entirely fluent English. The first time she had spoken English directly to him, probably the first time she had allowed anyone in this facility other than the man from Washington to know she could. "Sergeant McAllister," she said, "I know what you think of German women who were part of that system. I am not asking you to revise that. But I want you to know that those 4 women in there are asking the right questions now. They did not know how to before. They are learning. Do not let what happens next waste that." Bob stood at the gate in the pre-dawn cold and looked at her. "Where did you learn English like that?" "From an American," she said. During the war, one of yours." She picked up her bag and walked to the vehicle and got in. The vehicle moved down the drive and turned onto the road and was gone into the Massachusetts dark. Bob stood at the gate for 2 minutes after the taillights disappeared. Then he turned and walked back into the facility and continued his shift. That afternoon, April arrived. It arrived the way April arrives in Massachusetts, grudgingly, and with reservations, patches of warmth between stretches of cold that make you doubt the warmth was real. But the light was different. It stayed longer. In the evening, after the mess hall closed, and before the lights out call, there was an hour of pale gold light that came through the windows of Building C and lay across the common room floor in long rectangles that had not been there in December or January or February. In the 3rd week of April, there was a moment that Bob had not anticipated and that he was not certain afterward how to classify. He had come to the common room to deliver a scheduled notification, and Liesel Brandt was the only person in the room. She looked up when he came in, and then, after a pause that was different from her usual pauses, said something in German. Bob looked at her. She said it again, and then, recognizing that he had not understood, said it a 3rd time in slow, careful English, each word chosen individually like someone crossing a stream on stepping stones. "You stayed," she said, "in February, for the session. You did not have to." Bob set the schedule notification on the table. "I had a post assignment." She looked at him steadily. "You chose the assignment." He said nothing. "In Germany," she said, still in the careful stepping stone English, "a person in your position would not have chosen, or the choice would have been made for them, to be elsewhere, to not be present for things that were not required." She paused. "Here you chose to be present, I noticed." Bob picked up the schedule notification, set it down again, and then said something he had not planned to say and had not known he was going to say until it was already said. Dr. Sullivan told me something in January about what it costs to do your job without what you needed. I have been thinking about it since then. I don't have a better explanation than that. Liesel looked at him for a moment. Then she said, still carefully, still across the stepping stones, she told me something also. She said that she treats people because she refuses to let what has happened make her into something she does not want to be. I have been thinking about this also. She picked up her book and returned to reading. Bob left the schedule notification on the table and walked out. He wrote to Mary that evening, I think the most important thing I have learned here is about the difference between forgetting and refusing. I cannot explain it clearly yet. I will try when I get home. Now, there was one more thing that happened for the summer in the repatriation orders. One thing that Bob witnessed without being meant to, and that he never wrote down in his journal, because some things are too private to write down even in a notebook nobody else will read. It was a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of May, and Bob was making his regular rounds when he saw Erna Vogel standing in the corridor outside the laundry room, speaking in a low voice with a woman Bob recognized from Building D, a heavy-set woman in her late 40s, whose husband had been a facility administrator somewhere in the occupied territories. Bob had seen this woman around the facility for months and had always noted a particular hardness in her, a compressed combativeness that he associated with the people who had been powerful and resented the loss of it. The woman was asking Erna something. Bob stood far enough back to be out of their sight line and watched. He could not hear what was being said, but he could read the body language clearly enough. The Building D woman was asking a question that Erna did not want to answer. The question was about Ilsa. Bob could tell by the way Erna's posture changed, a slight drawing inward, a tightening the posture of someone who has just recognized a danger they had been moving toward without seeing. Bob watched Erna stand in that corridor with that question in front of her. He thought about a woman at a window with a cup of tea still steaming on the table. He thought about the two words written in careful handwriting at the bottom of the drawing. I watched. Erna Vogel looked at the Building D woman for a long moment. Then she said something that was short 3 or 4 words at most, and turned and walked away down the corridor. The Building D woman stood for a moment, then turned in the other direction. Bob remained where he was until both women were out of sight. Then he continued his rounds. That evening, he saw Ernana in the courtyard and she saw him. They looked at each other for a second across the courtyard, the way two people look at each other when they both know what happened and have silently agreed not to discuss it. Bob gave her a single nod. Erna looked back at the ground and walked on. He did not write about it that night, but he remembered it for the rest of his life. In August, the repatriation orders came through, and the summer, which had arrived properly and without reservations, lay over the facility in a warmth that made the whole winter seem like it had happened to someone else. The courtyard garden, which had been untended since before the war, had been worked by several of the women over the spring months, and it had responded the way gardens respond when they are paid attention to after long neglect. Not immediately and not without difficulty, but genuinely putting up tomatoes along the south wall and beans along the fence line that nobody had expected. The morning of departure was a Thursday in the second week of August, and the sky was the particular blue of New England summer, the blue that makes you believe the season will last forever, even though you know from experience it will not. Dr. Sullivan came to the courtyard and shook hands with each woman. When she reached Liesel, she placed a sealed envelope in her hands and said something that Bob, standing 20 feet away at the gate, did not hear. Liesel looked at the envelope, then at Dr. Sullivan, then back at the envelope. She put it in her coat pocket and nodded once, the nod of someone making a promise. Hannah Schreiber walked to the gate and stood in front of Bob. She was carrying her cloth bag in one hand and one of the green notebooks in the other. She opened the notebook to the last page and tore it out carefully along the binding and held it out to him. He took it and looked at it. It was Tommy. Not the photograph Bob sometimes took out of his breast pocket when he thought no one was watching. It was Tommy, as Hannah had constructed him from a single glimpse across a room farming, as interpreted by someone who had been paying close attention to the things people pay attention to when they are trying to understand what has been lost and why. The likeness was not perfect, but it was true in the way that certain things are true without being accurate true in the way that matters most. Bob folded the drawing once and placed it in his breast pocket without speaking. Hannah walked to the transport vehicle without looking back. Erna Vogel stopped beside Bob on her way to the vehicle and said in English that was no longer made of stepping stones, but of small, solid planks. I learn 30 words a week. She paused. I will keep learning. Good, Bob said. I will teach my students, she said. What questions are allowed? She got on the vehicle. Clara Mühlberg was last. She came across the courtyard with her spine straight in the way it had been straight on the first night. But the straightness was different now. It was not the rigidity of performance. It was the straightness of someone who has decided what they are going to do next and has organized themselves accordingly. She stopped in front of Bob and looked at him for a moment. Then she spoke in German and then waited and then said it again in the 3 words of English she had apparently decided were sufficient for what she needed to convey. Thank you, she said. The chair. She got on the vehicle. Bob stood at the gate and watched the transport move down the drive. He watched it until it turned onto the road and was gone, the same road Ilse Hartmann's vehicle had taken in the pre-dawn dark 5 months earlier. He stood at the gate for 2 minutes after it disappeared. Then he turned and walked back across the courtyard past the tomatoes on the south wall and the beans on the fence line and went to his office and sat down and opened his journal. He wrote for a long time. When he was finished, he read back over what he had written, which he almost never did. Then he added 1 paragraph at the end. He wrote, I think what America did here was not dramatic. Nobody is going to make a film about it. What it was is this: we had the power to treat these women badly, and we chose not to. We had the materials to provide for them, and we did. We had the freedom to ignore them, and we paid attention instead. None of these things felt significant while they were happening. They were just the job. But I think the job was the whole point. I think what we were defending, the thing that Tommy died for and I came home carrying shrapnel for, was not the big dramatic version of this. It was the daily version. The part where you have the power and you choose what to do with it. The part that nobody writes down. He closed the journal. He put on his cap. He picked up the phone and dialed Mary's number in Lowell. And when she answered, he said, I'm coming home in 3 weeks. I have something I want to tell you. Mary said, I know. I could hear it in the last letter. Come home, Bob. What happened to the 4 German women after the transport turned onto that August road is a different story. 4 different stories, each one written in a different hand, but with the same ink. Liesel Brandt returned to a Germany she no longer recognized and found her way, after months of difficulty, to Munich. The sealed envelope from Dr. Sullivan contained a letter of professional reference addressed to the director of a hospital being rebuilt in the American occupation zone. Liesel presented it, was hired, and spent the next 25 years practicing obstetric nursing. In 1952, she became the first nurse at her hospital to implement a standardized system for distributing menstrual hygiene products to all female patients without exception, without shame, and without requiring a formal medical order. When the hospital administrator asked her why she considered this a priority, she said, because someone once showed me what it costs when it is not won, and I have not forgotten. She retired in 1971. The nurses she trained still work in hospitals across Bavaria. Hanna Schreiber went to Frankfurt and found a job at a small newspaper in the American sector. She drew illustrations for 3 years before she began writing, and when she began writing, she wrote about things that made people uncomfortable. The neighbors who had disappeared, the papers signed without questions, the ordinary life that had continued alongside the extraordinary horror. Many readers wrote to tell her she was wrong to dwell on it. Many others wrote to tell her she was the first person who had said out loud what they had been unable to say. She kept all the letters, both kinds, in the same box. She worked for 40 years. Her last column was published in 1988. In it, she wrote, I learned to draw the things I had seen but not acted on. I learned that bearing witness after the fact is not the same as witnessing in the moment, but it is not nothing either. It is the only thing I know how to do, so I keep doing it. Clara Mühlberg returned to Bavaria to find her house confiscated and her name on a list of people requiring denazification review. She rented a single room from a farming family outside the town where she had once been someone. She worked for 2 years in near total obscurity, doing whatever work came to hand before someone from the local Red Cross asked if she would be willing to help distribute food supplies to families in the resettlement camps nearby. She said yes. She did this work for 15 years without telling anyone who she had been. When she died in 1963, the farming family who had rented her the room found a single notebook in her belongings. The last entry read, I do not know if I have been forgiven. I have stopped asking that question. I ask instead, did I do something useful today? Most days I can answer yes. That is enough. Erna Vogel went home to Nuremberg and found her school still standing damaged but intact. She applied to teach and was accepted. She taught for 23 years. Her students remembered her for one thing above all others: she was the only teacher who allowed any question to be asked without penalty. In 1971, the last year before she retired, she pinned a reproduction of Hannah Schreiber's drawing to the wall of her classroom. The woman at the window, the cup of tea still steaming, the people in the street below. Underneath it, she wrote in German and in English, "I watched." Don't just watch. She did not explain where the drawing had come from, but she taught from it every year until she left. And Ilse Hartmann went somewhere that nobody who knew her at Fort Devens ever found out. 5 years after the transport left the facility, Erna received a letter with a Stockholm postmark and no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence written on it. "Everything is fine. I still choose right. So do you." Erna kept the letter in the drawer of her teacher's desk for 22 years. She showed it to no one, but there were days on hard days on days when she was not sure the questions she allowed in her classroom were making any difference at all, when she opened the drawer and read that sentence, and then closed the drawer and went back to teaching. Bob McAllister flew into Boston on a Saturday morning in September, and Mary was at the airport, and she looked exactly like herself, which was the thing he had been most afraid would not be true, and it was. He set down his bag, and she put her arms around him and said nothing, which was the right thing, the same right thing she had always done, and he held on for a long time. They drove back to Lowell on Route 3 with the windows down, because the September air in Massachusetts is the best air in the world, which is a thing you only know for certain when you have been away from it for a long time. That evening at the kitchen table with the KB Mary maid, that was better than anything he had drunk in 9 months. Bob put Hannah's drawing of Tommy on the table between them. Mary looked at it for a long time. "Who drew this?" she said. "A German girl, 28 years old. She saw the photograph once when she thought I wasn't watching. She drew this from memory." Mary picked up the drawing and looked at it closely. Then she set it down and went to the cupboard and came back with one of the small frames she kept for photographs. She fitted the drawing into the frame without asking him if that was what he wanted, because she knew it was. She held it up. "Where do we put it?" she said. "Next to Tommy," he said. She carried it to the hallway and hung it on the wall beside the photograph of Tommy in his uniform, the photograph taken 3 weeks before Guadalcanal. Tommy grinning the way he always grinned, as if whatever was coming was going to be fine. Hannah's drawing hung beside it. Different medium, different hand, the same person somehow, the same truth about him. Bob stood in the hallway and looked at both of them for a long time. Then Mary took his hand and said, "Come sit down and tell me the thing you've been trying to tell me for months." He sat down. He told her. Not all of it at once. It took several evenings across several weeks, the story coming out in the way stories come out when they are too large for a single telling. He told her about Liesel and the white package and the weight of something held in both hands. He told her about Hannah's notebook and the drawing of the woman at the window and the 2 German words. He told her about Clara on the floor in the January dark, and about sitting in a chair without understanding a word, and about Tommy on the train from Boston saying, "I know." That's why it helped. He told her about Dr. Sullivan refusing to let what had happened determine what she became. He told her about Ilse at the gate in the pre-dawn dark saying she was ours. Mary listened to all of it. When he was finished, she said, "You understand now why I packed the notebook." "I always understood why you packed the notebook." "No," she said. "Now you understand." He thought about that for a while. Then he said, "I think America's greatest weapon was not what I thought it was when I enlisted." "What did you think it was?" "The obvious things. The industry, the military capacity, the organization." And now, he looked at the hallway where Tommy and Hannah's drawing of Tommy hung side by side on the wall. "Now I think it was smaller than that, the daily version. The part where you have the power and you decide what to do with it. The part that doesn't get written down." He paused. "I think that's the whole thing. I think that's what we are when we are what we're supposed to be." Mary refilled his coffee without being asked, which was the thing she had always done, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the Massachusetts autumn was doing what it always did, changing everything and making it look inevitable. And Bob McAllister sat at his kitchen table in Lowell, in September of 1946 and felt for the first time since a Tuesday afternoon in Algiers in August of 1942 that the weight he was carrying was not lighter, but that he understood what it was for, which was not the same thing as being free of it, but it was enough. It was what he had. It was he thought what America had, not the absence of the weight, the understanding of what it was for, the daily choice to carry it in a way that meant something. That was the whole thing. That was what Tommy had died for, or the version that Bob McAllister could live inside of, which at a certain point becomes the same thing. In 1975, at his granddaughter's graduation from a small college in western Massachusetts, Bob McAllister was asked to say a few words. He was 68 years old. His shoulder still ached when the temperature dropped. He still kept Tommy's photograph in his breast pocket, folded twice, worn soft at the creases. Hannah's drawing of Tommy hung in the hallway of the house on Appleton Street next to the photograph where it had hung for 29 years. He stood at the podium and looked out at the rows of young faces and said, "I served in the Second World War. I crossed Omaha Beach. I lost my brother in the Pacific. I came home with metal in my shoulder that the doctors decided was safer to leave in. And after all of that, the Army gave me one more assignment: guard a group of German women in a detention facility in Massachusetts. I thought it was the worst assignment of my career. I was wrong. It was the most important one." He paused. "I learned something in those 6 months that Normandy didn't teach me and Hurtgen didn't teach me. I learned what America actually is. Not the big version, not the speeches and the parades, the small version, the daily version. The version that asks, when you have the power to treat someone badly and no one will know if you do, and you have every historical justification you need, what do you choose? A supply sergeant chose to put decent supplies in a box. A doctor chose to treat patients who were technically her enemies. A guard chose to sit down in a chair in the dark and stay. None of those people thought they were doing anything significant. They were just doing the job, but the job was the whole point." He looked at his granddaughter in the front row. "You're going to have your own version of that question. I don't know what it'll look like, but I know it'll come. And when it does, I want you to remember that the answer doesn't require a speech or a gesture or anything that anyone else will notice. It just requires the daily choice, the small version, the part that doesn't get written down." He stepped back from the podium. Mary was in the third row. She was looking at him the way she had always looked at him, the way she had looked at him at the train station in 1941 and the airport in 1946 and every morning in between and after. He walked back to his seat and she took his hand and held it for the rest of the ceremony without letting go. "Rest well, Tommy. You did your job. And then some."